at our pleasant experiences, we'll come to appreciate and see they're not really even in the nature of happiness. Because if our pleasant experiences were in the nature of happiness, it would mean that the more we engaged in pleasant experiences, the more happy we should become. But we know from our own experience that often if we overindulge in our pleasant experiences, not only don't we find more happiness, often we end up with a lot of suffering. Example, eating too much of our favourite dessert, spending too long out in the nice warm sunshine. They don't make us more happy, we just end up with suffering. So therefore, what we can appreciate is that our pleasant experiences are relative experiences. Relative to a previous state, they're an improvement, but if we overindulge in them, they can lead to suffering. But then we can talk about genuine happiness, and genuine happiness is a state of inner well-being, and so therefore it's not stimulus-based. It doesn't require any particular stimulus to be present. Therefore, it is stable, reliable, and in the nature of happiness. And this is a state of inner well-being that can be there regardless of what's going on around us. Now, what we tend to do now is we conflate the two. We now are wanting or hoping for this to give us this. We're hoping that pleasure is going to satisfy us and give us some sort of lasting happiness. But of course, since it's a temporary experience, transient, what happens then is we end up trying to hold on to our pleasant experiences. In other words, craving and attachment. If we have craving and attachment for our pleasant experiences, that just leads to suffering. Because with that craving and attachment often comes worry, anxiety about not getting it, not getting enough of it, or losing it. And of course, if we don't get it, frustration. Even if we do get it, never really fully satisfies us. We end up craving more. And if we overindulge, often have a lot of suffering. And then, of course, also what happens is that for craving and attachment, we're never satisfied. Which means that if we enjoy something that we like too often, after some time craving and attachment goes, sorry, not good enough anymore. I want something bigger, better and different. So we end up even losing out on the things we used to enjoy because craving and attachment at some point says that's not good enough anymore. I need something bigger, better and different. Whereas, if we can identify that there are two forms of happiness, this is a stimulus-based happiness, this is not, and if we can strive for this goal of genuine happiness, inner well-being, by working with our mind, transforming our mind, then you will find that you will enjoy your pleasurable experiences much more than you do now. So, sometimes people feel like it's a choice. Either I have to do the pleasure thing, or if I go for this, I have to give up my pleasure. This is complete misunderstanding. So, it's not about the choice. If we strive for this, then if we have a pleasurable experience, we'll actually enjoy it much more than we do now, because we'll realise that it's never going to fulfil us, and so if it's there, we enjoy it. If it's not, it doesn't matter. And so we'll let go of all the craving and attachment, fear and anxiety, frustration, disappointment and so forth. And we will enjoy them much more. So therefore, we are to understand the unsatisfactory nature of samsara in that these pleasurable experiences are never going to give us lasting, genuine happiness. And at the deeper level, understand that the genuine happiness, or that we are stuck in this state of samsara because of our contaminated mind. And thereby we can eliminate this contaminated mind of mental afflictions by realising the nature of reality, that we can overcome our distorted view of reality through the Vipassana practice. And so if we can understand this, then instead of looking out there for a source of happiness and suffering, we'll turn our attention inwards. And so that's what's the final line in this text, in this verses here says, and since there is no genuine happiness to be found within the abodes of samsara, I must correctly practice the true Dharma. Meaning that we then turn our attention inwards to work to strive for this goal of genuine happiness, well-being, by eliminating this contaminated mind through our Vipassana practice. So these are the 4 thoughts that turn the mind, the 4 common preliminaries, which means that if we reflect on those and we've internalized those, then at the beginning of a meditation practice, if we then briefly reflect on those 4 points, then when we come to generating, sincerely going for refuge, generating bodhicitta, I don't think it will be just merely words from our mouth. Any questions about that before we move on in the text? Okay. In the next paragraph, it says, in general, as a preliminary to giving any profound instructions or engaging in meditation, all the holy beings of the different traditions in Tibet concord in doing what is called the 4 guiding instructions. Going for refuge and generating bodhicitta, Vajrasattva meditation, mandala offering, and guru yoga. So these 4 are what's called the 4 uncommon preliminaries. So these preliminaries here are common, meaning that this is the foundation for all systems of practice, whether we're talking Theravada or Mahayana. If we reflect on those 4 points, then that is the foundation for going into whatever shamatha vipassana practice we're doing within Theravada or Mahayana in general. So these are preceding the shamatha vipassana in general. The uncommon preliminaries here, which is again we see here refuge and bodhicitta. The second one is this Vajrasattva practice. The third one he mentioned is this mandala offering, and the 4th one is guru yoga. So these are uncommon preliminaries in that these are the preliminary practices for the Tantra or Vajrayana level of practice. So this is the preliminaries for the Sutra level of practice that we're going to be looking at starting tomorrow. And then the Tantra level, which we're just briefly touching on this morning, or this afternoon rather, is for that level of practice, which actually, we practice this first, then that, but in the text, they come in either in the opposite order, because here he's just briefly mentioning what it is, and then he doesn't describe the practice at all. That's for much later. So the preliminaries for this is this. If we want to engage in Tantra or Vajrayana, these are the preliminary practices, and that's what's being said here. So the first one, refuge and bodhicitta, each one has a purpose. So we saw that in the previous sentence, that refuge and bodhicitta is the door of entry and the central support for the practice. That this is the door of entry and the support for practice. And here, in these preliminaries, when we talk about refuge, in general, of course, we talk refuge is Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. But here, when in the context of preliminaries for Tantra, refuge includes three more things. It includes what's called the yidam, which is your personal deity that you're practicing. It includes what's called dharma protectors, beings that help us. And the last one, the guru, the teacher. So refuge here is a little bit more extensive. But in general, in the foundation level, of course, refuge is just Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. So this is the entry and support for our practice. Vajrasattva, what's that for? We can go down in the text a bit more and have a look. In the next paragraph it says, since in their treatises on authentic sutras and tantras, every Indian and Tibetan scholar and adept praise those paths highly. Do not think that they are merely preliminaries, even though they have been explained in the context of the preliminaries, but rather practice them by integrating them into your actual practice. So whether we're talking common preliminaries or uncommon preliminaries, what the Panchen Lama is saying is that even though these are presented in the context of preliminaries, he says, don't think of them as preliminaries, but integrate them into your actual practice. And this, unfortunately, is what happens, is we hear about these preliminaries, and in Tibetan Buddhism it's called Numdro, literally means what goes before. These preliminaries, we go, okay, and then we sort of, these ones we sort of just think about a little bit and we go, yeah, I understand that, okay, done. And these ones usually, in Tibetan Buddhism, they're presented in a form of doing each one 100,000 times. And usually this one is with 100,000 prostrations. This is reciting a mantra 100,000 times. This is doing a particular offering 100,000 times. And this is also usually reciting some verse 100,000 times. And so often what happens is that people who come into Tibetan Buddhism and particular schools of Tibetan Buddhism, they hear about these practices and they think that because they're called preliminaries, oh, that's the very first thing I need to do. That's a preliminary to everything, which they're not. They're preliminaries to Tantra, not to practice in general, but often they are presented or seen as preliminaries to practice in general. So the first thing that often people do is they do these, 100,000 of every one, and of course they're very tough to do, and these are all in flavour, particularly the last three, are very tantric in flavour, the practice. And of course when we do them as the very first thing, we don't understand at all what they're about. We try them as best we can, and usually not much happens because we don't know what the practice is, and often we get very frustrated and maybe start having aversion. What are these practices? Why am I doing these very esoteric, strange things? Because we don't appreciate what they're for. And they're not preliminaries to practice in general, they're preliminaries for Tantra, Vajrayana. So what is Vajrasattva here? What is that about? So if we read the next paragraph, it says, moreover, since seeing the ultimate nature of the mind is dependent upon having accumulated the collections and purified the obscurations, recite the 100-syllable mantra of Vajrasattva at least 100,000 times, and in addition, as an essential practice, earnestly confess negative actions and promise to refrain from doing them again by completing the 4 opponent powers through practices such as making as many hundreds of prostrations as possible while reciting the admission of downfalls. So what it's saying here is that it says if we want to realise the ultimate nature of the mind, if we really want to engage in this Mahamudra practice, then we need to accumulate the collections and purify the obscurations. 2 things. Purifying obscurations, purifying negative imprints, negative habits in our mind. Accumulating collections increase the positive states of mind. These are two core elements. And that's what these two practices do. So again, the refuge and bodhicitta is the entry and support. The Vajrasattva practice is to help us to purify our mind of negativities. The mandala offering is for accumulating, here it says accumulating the collections. And we'll look at the purpose of Guru Yoga a little bit later. So we've got these two aspects of purification and accumulation. Purification, again, purifying our mind of negative imprints, negative habits, and accumulation is increasing the positive states of mind. And in the Tantra level of practice, the most common form that we use for purification is the Vajrasattva practice, and for accumulation when you do this mandala offering. But again, these are very much tantric level practices. So, of course, at the sutra level, at the foundation level, we also want to purify the mind and accumulate the positive states of mind. So how can we do that? So this is really Tantra level. So what about Sutra level? So in terms of entry and support, at the Sutra level of practice, we also have refuge and bodhicitta. And in terms of purification, we can see in the text it says that earnestly confess negative actions and promise to refrain from them, having, again, by completing the 4 opponent powers. So this is really the core of purification. So therefore, at our level, at the sutra level of practice, if we want to purify our mind of negativities, then these 4 opponent powers is what we can do. These 4 opponent powers is the essence of the Vajrasattva practice. The core of Vajrasattva practice is the 4 opponent powers, but they're packaged in a very tantric form. And if we don't understand what Tantra is, then it's difficult to do this effectively. But we, at our level, of course, we can do this. This is not so complicated. So what are these 4 opponent powers? These are 4 things we can do to purify the mind of negative habits, negative imprints. The first is regret, and that is that if we've done something harmful, to have developed sincere regret at having done that. Here, of course, we need to distinguish between regret and guilt. If we've done something harmful and we feel guilty, what are we focusing on? Bad me. Guilt is completely useless. All it does is it makes us feel bad, it paralyses us. It's not even addressing the negative behaviour. So guilt is completely useless. And in fact, it comes from an invalid perspective. So we don't need to feel guilty about anything. It doesn't help at all. Rather, if we've done something harmful and we regret, what are we focusing on? The action. So regret comes from a correct perspective, simply acknowledging, I have done this harmful behaviour, and having sincere regret for that. So sincere regret is already weakening that imprint and weakening that negative tendency or habit. The second thing we can do is reliance, sometimes translated as foundation. And the second thing in the 4 opponent powers is to reaffirm our positive direction in life. Because if we've done something harmful, we've sort of fallen down from our basis, our good basis of life, our direction of life, positive direction of life. So it's about picking ourselves back up and reaffirming our positive direction. And here, of course, in the Mahayana, that involves going for refuge, generating bodhicitta, reaffirming that this is the direction we want to follow our life. So by reaffirming that through refuge and bodhicitta here, that also is weakening that negative behaviour, negative imprint. The third one is remedy, is to think of some sort of practical remedy for the negative behaviour. And generally it's best to try to do something directly positive opposite to the negative behaviour. For example, if we verbally abuse someone at work, remedy, apologise. Something directly positive opposite. If that's not possible for whatever reason, any virtuous behaviour with a motivation of wishing to overcome that negative behaviour is effective. Then the fourth thing is resolve, and that is to make a strong determination not to do that negative behaviour again. Here we need to be practical. If the negative behaviour we do is a very strong habit and we're doing it quite often, there's no point in saying I'm never going to do that again, because it's not going to happen. So set a time limit and say, for the next day, I'm not going to do that thing. If that's way too difficult, for the next hour, I'm not going to do that thing. If that's way too difficult, for the next 10 minutes, I'm not going to do that thing. Set an amount of time with some effort, normally you can manage. And then over time, you can extend it from 10 minutes to an hour to a day, a week, a month, rest of your life. So that way you can even start to break very strong habits. So ideally then, if as soon as we've noticed we've done something harmful, to go through these four opponent powers, and that's a way of purifying our mind of negativities, negative habits, negative imprints. Any questions about that?
Would you say that these four intentions-wise are quite similar in their base to practicing right effort from the Eightfold Paths?
So the question is, these are similar to right effort?
In terms of intention-wise, to decrease negative appearances in the mind that already has rise, and to also to prevent them from coming up, and also to uplift more
the positive
and all that hasn't risen yet.
Yeah.
And to those who are already risen, to give them.
So yes, the second two there are this. That the first two are related to this. So yes, this is, of course, this is after the event. So part of that is to restrain ourselves so that we don't end up having to do this. That to restrain ourselves from actually acting in a negative way, to be very conscientious and mindful that when some negative intention is coming up, we're sort of not allowing that to act out.
That's when it's already too late.
Yeah, so this is already once we've done something. So that, of course, goes together with that, but ideally, then we can do this is to be more mindful and not to act on our what's coming up in our mind, so that then we don't need to go through this. So, but they, of course, they're all part of the same thing, of purifying the mind. Any other questions? Yeah.
How would you apply the four opponent powers for a behavior that you used to have, but you no longer have it, but you still want to wipe out the imprints?
Yeah, because again, you can just remember past times where you acted in a negative way and regret having done that, reaffirm your positive direction, and then again, if there's some positive opposite that you can keep working on, and really keep that strong determination which you already have to not do it again. So this is, yeah, I mean, it's not like It doesn't have to be for just something we did just now. I mean, we can help, because like you said, that even though maybe we're not doing that behaviour, maybe there's still some imprints there, and if we're not conscientious and we allow our mindfulness to slip, then maybe later we start doing that thing again. So this is going to help reduce that likelihood of that happening in the future. Yeah.
Part of purification, there is a ceremony for purification.
Sorry, there's what?
A ceremony.
Ceremony
Yeah.
in purification?
Yeah.
What do you mean, ceremony?
Something like making a fire.
Oh, yeah, there's one of the things, again, it's a very much a tantric flavour. There's a thing called Dorji Kadro, which is, again, you, and again, this is four opponent powers. So the four opponent powers is the core, and then we can use that in various forms. The one that's used commonly is Vajrasattva, but also then we can use other ones like Dorji Kadro, and there's one here that's mentioning this admission to downfalls. This sometimes goes by the name 35 Buddhas practice. So again, it's packaged slightly differently, but the core of these practices is the four opponent powers. But we implement them in various ways, doing different visualizations, and in this practice, we tend to use external things like burning seeds to help us to understand this idea of purification. It's like an external thing to help us to internalize, to do something internal in the mind. Of course, in these sort of practices, if we have some practice we're following and we're mindlessly reciting some stuff and throwing some seeds in a fire, I don't think much is happening, you know. It's not the external things, you know, it's not saying some words and throwing some seeds in a fire, it's what's going on in the mind. And so if these four opponent powers are not happening in the mind, then I think this practice is not going to be very effective.
Obvious.
It might be nice to throw some seeds in the fire or something, but that's about it. Okay. Yeah, and so then the next one is not described any more than mandala. He's just talking briefly about accumulating the collections. And so here we're talking about engaging in the positive behaviours. And so here in our sutra level of practice, then we can talk about the 6 perfections as the practices we're doing. You know, things like generosity and ethics and patience and so forth is helping us to engage in this accumulating of merit. And also what we find is that, of course, here, these uncommon preliminaries, we do them usually in the form of a 100,000 repetitions. So as an extensive practice that may take weeks or longer to complete. But of course, what often happens, and that's what the Panchen Lama said we should not do, he said that do not think of them merely as merely preliminaries. And that's what people do. They do this practice, 100,000 of this, tick, 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 done that, what next? And then, I need some more advanced stuff now, and then they leave this behind. And that's what Panchen Lama is saying we should not do. We need to integrate them to our actual practice. And so we see that actually in these prayers for meditation. Is this prayer for meditation, which again is at the sutra level, so this is not a tantra level practice, is we see these steps. The entry and support. We have the refuge and bodhicitta. And again, not to be merely words from the mouth, we can reflect on the 4 common preliminaries before that. And then after you have that is the 4 immeasurables, which are also helping us for the support, for the bodhicitta. So the 4 immeasurables are the basis of bodhicitta. So reflecting on these 4 immeasurables is also helping for that. And then we have this 7-limb prayer. 7 points here where it talks about I reverently, I prostrate with my body, speech and mind. I present clouds of every type of offering. I declare all my negative actions accumulating billions of time. I rejoice in the merit of holy beings, ordinary beings. Please reign until